Hello BookTube. I've got a children's classic for you today, Matilda by Roald Dahl, which, believe it or not, this is my first time reading it. I have somehow managed to make it this far in life without reading Matilda. So the first time I really remember hearing about Matilda was when that movie came out in 1996. I was just starting college at the time, so I wasn't interested in children's movies, but I did see some of the commercials for it on TV, and they advertised it as a Roald Dahl movie, or a movie based on the Roald Dahl novel. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't remember that story particularly, but I must have read it, or I must have had it read to me, because all my teachers in elementary school were always reading Roald Dahl. And I just thought, and the name Matilda also sounded familiar from childhood. I thought, yeah, there was a story about a Matilda who was in a school, right? That sounds familiar. A few years later, when YouTube became a thing and reviews of that Matilda movie or summaries of that Matilda movie started popping up on YouTube, like The Nostalgia Critic, etc., and I started watching some of the reviews / summary of those movies. Sorry, that movie. At that point, I began to realize this story does not seem familiar at all. I don't think I ever read this story as a kid. I had thought it sounded familiar, but I didn't recognize the story at all. Ever since then, I guess I've been meaning to get around to reading the story of Matilda. Now, I think I've figured out what the point of confusion was. I thought that the name Matilda sounded familiar to me because I was getting it mixed up in my head with Madeline. Anyone remember Madeline? It's a book about a girl with a yellow hat who is a schoolgirl at a girls' school in France, and they go into Paris to see the Eiffel Tower. So that was the children's book I was getting confused with Matilda. That's why I thought, okay, I think I did read that in childhood or had it read to me. No, but that was Madeline. Matilda actually was never read to me in my elementary school. And I was looking this book up on Wikipedia, and it turns out that this book didn't come out until 1988, at which point I was almost done with elementary school. Certainly the bulk of the Roald Dahl that was read to me in elementary school was in first grade, second grade, and third grade. By the time I got into fourth and fifth grade, we were moving on to a bit heavier stuff. So I didn't realize it, but this book was after my time. I didn't realize this in 1996 because Wikipedia or the modern internet was not around back then. So you really had no way of knowing these things. Or at the very least, it was a lot more difficult to know these things. Roald Dahl was considered a classic children's author when I was in school in the 1980s. And his early books, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, I think date from the 1960s. So he was already around and he was already established by the time I was in school. And I just always assumed that all of his books were before my time. But a little bit of looking on the internet shows that's not true. This book was only written in 1988, so this book was actually after my time. And that means that the 1996 movie, which to this day I've never seen, when that came out, this book was less than 10 years old. So there you go. The book I have here is the movie tie-in book. I think since 1996, it's been made into a few different movies. And this tie-in is to one of the Netflix movies that came out a couple years ago. I haven't seen any of it. The only reason I got the movie tie-in cover is because that's what the bookshop was selling. I got this book when I was still in Vietnam. But when you open up the book, once you get past the cover, it's just the classic Roald Dahl text in the illustrations. These illustrations are by Quentin Blake, who illustrated, I think, most of the Roald Dahl books, and the Quentin Blake illustrations I always associate with Roald Dahl. I was checking this on Wikipedia right before I filmed this review, where I learned a number of interesting facts, this and that. And apparently there's the version that came out in 2023 had a number of alterations from Roald Dahl's original text. So some of the language was softened, any reference to skin color was omitted. This book talks a lot about books. Matilda is a great reader and she has a lot of favorite authors. Apparently references to authors like Rudyard Kipling and Joseph Conrad were removed, according to Wikipedia, although there were actually still some references to Rudyard Kipling in here. So maybe some of them were removed and some of them weren't, I don't know. But Wikipedia did cite an example from the first few pages about one example of the text that was altered, compared it to the original and the altered 2023 version. And I looked at that, and I definitely have the altered 2023 version. I would have preferred the original just because I'm a purist that way, but there you go. I had no idea when I bought this in bookstores that this was the altered version. According to Wikipedia, the backlash against this, there was some backlash against this, especially because Roald Dahl, when he was alive, did not want any of his books altered. So this is very much going against the author's wishes. He's now dead. So they've republished them in two different lines now. There's Roald Dahl and there's Roald Dahl Classics. But yeah, I think I actually bought this a couple of years ago. I bought it for my wife initially. So I probably did buy this right in 2023. Okay, anyways, the review. What did I think of this book? So I am coming to this as an adult, but Roald Dahl is really just an amazing author, isn't he? I mean, he is just so incredibly readable. And I started off with chapter 1 and was just immediately sucked into this. We could nitpick this and that, and we probably will in a few minutes, but it's just so readable. Even though, it's for children, but you just get sucked into it. And you really enjoy Roald Dahl's prose. In fact, maybe I'll just illustrate this. This is right from chapter 1, so right from the beginning. He says, "It's a funny thing about parents. Even when their own child is the most disgusting little blister you could ever imagine, they still think that they are wonderful. Some parents go further. They become so blinded by adoration they manage to convince themselves their child has qualities of genius. Well, there is nothing very wrong with all this. It's the way of the world. It is only when the parents begin telling us about the brilliance of their own revolting offspring that we start shouting, 'Bring us a basin, we're going to be sick.' School teachers suffer a good deal from having to listen to this sort of twaddle from proud parents, but they usually get their own back when the time comes to write the end-of-term reports. If I were a teacher, I would cook up some real scorchers for the children of doting parents. Your son Maximilian, I would write, is a total washout. I hope you have a family business you can push him into when he leaves school, because he sure as heck won't get a job anywhere else. Or if I were feeling lyrical that day, I might write, 'It is a curious truth that grasshoppers have their hearing organs in the sides of their abdomen. Judging by what your daughter Vanessa has learnt this term, this fact alone is more interesting than anything I have taught her in the classroom.' etc. So you can see as a new reader, you're like, oh, okay, wait, what's the story here? Where are we going with this? Who are our main characters? And he does get there eventually, but he just starts off with this wonderful description of overly fond parents and then how teachers get their revenge on them in the reports. And it goes on like that for a couple more pages before we even get around to introducing Matilda. So that kind of just lovely writing just sucks you right in. By the way, excuse me, those last few lines I was reading about the hearing organs in the side of the abdomen, sorry. That's actually the example Wikipedia cites of how this version is different than the original. And you can go on Wikipedia yourself to see the two versions compared. So that's how that passage is how I knew I had gotten the altered version here. Anyways, if you're not familiar with this book is about Matilda, who is a very precocious little child who can do everything easily and is just such the perfect child. As I was reading this, I thought to myself, okay, why is Matilda being portrayed here as such the perfect child? I mean, I understand she's our protagonist and stuff like that, but surely Roald Dahl, I mean, you don't want your protagonist to be too cute and perfect, right? Although, interestingly enough, as I was looking at Wikipedia about the history of this book, the initial drafts, actually, Roald Dahl had Matilda start off as an awful child who had these superpowers and was using them for evil purposes or mischievous purposes. And it was one of his friends and editors who eventually worked with him to convince him to shape the story around so that Matilda was the good guy and the teachers and parents were the awful ones, or the headmistress and the parents in this case. So with the Roald Dahl books, you quite often get very awful adult figures, authority figures, or parents. And in this book, we've got a couple of them. There's Mrs. Wormwood and Mr. Wormwood. Mr. Wormwood is a used car salesman who has a ratty look with two front teeth sticking out and likes to dress in loud clothing. As always, the Roald Dahl books, the Roald Dahl books, and they're children's books, of course, but they are appealing to a primitive part of your brain. The part of your brain that desperately wants the satisfaction of seeing bad people get their comeuppance. And of course, as a child, you just get completely sucked into this. And to a certain extent, as an adult, you do as well. But as an adult, there's always that little thing in the back of your mind telling you, okay, these aren't real people. Real people aren't like this. This is just something that the author is doing to try and get you to hate these characters as much as possible because he's trying to manipulate your feelings, etc. You still enjoy the book, but you have that in the back of your mind telling you that. But interesting thing, according to Wikipedia, Mr. Wormwood here was based on a real person from Roald Dahl's hometown. So I guess he maybe knew a sleazy car dealer who was similar to Mr. Wormwood. And Miss Trunchbull, the evil headmistress, was based on somebody that Roald Dahl knew. So I'm going to get into a little bit of spoilers here. If you've not read the book and you're concerned about spoilers, you may want to turn off here. But Matilda's parents are very evil to her, very, very nasty to her. And Matilda eventually gets the idea of pulling little pranks on them to get little revenge. For example, gluing her father's hat on to his head with super glue so it can't be removed. Or sticking a parrot up the chimney so that the house thinks that there's a ghost. And this is fun to read. It doesn't particularly go anywhere, but it is fun to read. And then finally Matilda starts school. This is the British system, so it doesn't say she's in kindergarten. I think it says she's in the first grade or the first form. Her teacher is the kind Mrs. Honey, but there is the mean Miss Trunchbull, who is the headmistress and terrifies the children. So Roald Dahl books always have a dark sense of humor, which is why they're so appealing to children. And that sense of humor is fully on here, although it's a bit more toned down than some of the other Roald Dahl books. Nobody dies. None of the children get eaten or vaporized or anything like that, which is more than you can say for some of the other Roald Dahl books. They do get thrown from windows, but they survive. Some of them get slightly deformed. One child has his ears stretched out permanently. The book is at great pains to let us know that this is something permanent now, that his ears are not going to go back to the way they used to be. But again, it's tamer than other Roald Dahl books, and again, this kind of dark humor is what makes Roald Dahl so appealing. Roald Dahl also does a very good job of stretching out a scene here. So there are a few confrontations with Mrs. Trunchbull, which last for several pages. Particularly Bruce Bogtrotter and the cake. Miss Trunchbull knows that Bruce Bogtrotter has had a slice of her cake, so she calls him up to the front, and there's a lot of suspense going on. Well, Miss Trunchbull is playing with Bruce Bogtrotter. We don't know exactly what his punishment is going to be, and that suspense lurks over several pages before we finally find out what exactly it's going to be. He has to eat a whole cake, which of course he cannot do without getting sick, and yet as the scene progresses, he actually pulls it off. And the whole thing, I thought, is just a master example of Roald Dahl setting the scene, letting the tension simmer, and then just milking that tension for several pages, and pulling it off very well. I'm going to have to take back something or modify something slightly that I said in a previous review I did of one of the Roald Dahl books, which was The Witches by Roald Dahl. So The Witches also had one scene, the scene of the witches meeting, that just got milked for a lot of tension. I believe in The Witches it went on for 100 pages. Now, of course, these are 100 pages of kids' book with big print, but 100 pages of just milking the tension. And it struck me because at the time I read that, I had just gotten done rereading a bunch of other Roald Dahl books. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Charlie and the Glass Elevator, and the BFG. And those books were paced much differently. So when I read The Witches and I saw that this one scene was just being stretched out for so many pages, I thought, okay, this is different pacing than Roald Dahl usually does. And I got into Wikipedia, and Wikipedia said that Roald Dahl had a lot of help with The Witches, with a co-editor, which is why the tone is a little bit different than his other books. And I thought, that explains the pacing. But Matilda also has that similar pacing where some of these scenes are allowed to just simmer for several pages. So I thought, okay, maybe I was wrong when I attributed that to the new editor that Roald Dahl had on The Witches. Although, according to Wikipedia, that same editor was working with Roald Dahl on Matilda. And I forgot to write down his name before I did this review. It was something like Stephen Saxonbury or something like that. I'll look it up on Wikipedia and I'll try and remember to put it in the description down below. So yeah, I don't know. It's either Roald Dahl's collaborator or Roald Dahl himself, but there are several scenes, particularly the scenes that involve confrontations with Miss Trunchbull, which are very slow burners, and where the tension simmers for a little bit, but it works. It works brilliantly. You are hooked completely in flipping those pages. I was aware, just because I had seen some reviews of the movie on YouTube, like I said before, that Matilda had some sort of magical powers, which were a big part of the book. And I was expecting those magical powers to come up a lot earlier than they did. I was surprised when the magical powers didn't actually come up until chapter 14, the first miracle, which is on page 234. Starts on page 234. So we are already 2/3 of the way through the book before these magical powers come up. But the magical powers do dominate the last third of the book. So they are there. Excuse me. Tripping over my words as always, but I'll get there in the end. The ending of the book I thought was a little bit anticlimactic. It's not the normal ending you might associate with a Roald Dahl book. I typically just assume his endings go on a big bang or tend to be particularly gruesome. This ending, is not particularly. But it works. And there you have it. That's my review of Matilda. It's looks actually bigger than it is. It's a children's book with lots of illustration and big print. So I was able to read this very quickly in a couple of afternoons and thoroughly enjoyed it. So let me know what you thought of this book. When did you first read it? How do you think it compares to the other Roald Dahl books, etc.? What your experiences of this book were. So thank you very much, BookTube, and I will see you next time.